Handle it yourself. Those were the only words my parents left me after 22 years of calling that house my home. I can still see the ink, scrawled on a scrap of paper, taped to a broken lamp on the porch, like my entire life had been reduced to a cruel afterthought. I came back from university with exhaustion in my bones but hope in my chest. Finals had nearly broken me, but the thought of walking into my childhood home kept me going. I pictured my mom's cooking waiting on the table, the comfort of my old bed, the warmth of family after months of struggle. Instead, I was greeted by silence, a dead lawn, and a driveway littered with cardboard boxes stuffed with my belongings. It felt like stepping into someone else's life. Strangers were peeking through what used to be my bedroom window, pointing at the curtains my grandmother once sewed, as if they were bargaining over scraps. My home wasn't mine anymore. My memories had been boxed up, shoved out, and sold off without a second thought. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about losing a roof over my head, it was about losing the foundation I thought I could always rely on. The betrayal cut deeper than the sight of those boxes. It was the message behind them: you're on your own now. Before I reveal how karma turned this betrayal upside down, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next twist. My name is Eldrick Vance, and I'm 22. I had just come off the hardest semester of my life, buried in cybersecurity projects and exams that seemed designed to break me. For 3 nights in a row, I didn't close my eyes for more than an hour, living on energy drinks and vending machine snacks, pushing through because I believed it would all be worth it. Every keystroke, every page of notes, every late-night lecture replayed in my head came with one promise: once it was over, I'd finally go home. Home wasn't just a building to me. It was the place I pictured when I needed strength, the image that kept me from giving up when I thought my body couldn't take another night of study. I imagined my mom standing at the door, arms open, the smell of her food drifting from the kitchen the second I stepped inside. I imagined lying down in my old bed, the same mattress I'd had since I was a kid, finally getting a full night's sleep without worrying about coding assignments or security modules. Most of all, I imagined giving my mother the small gift I'd managed to save for despite my own struggles. During my layover in Chicago, I found it sitting on a dusty shelf in the airport shop, a ceramic mug that said "World's Best Mom" in bright yellow letters. It wasn't expensive, but it felt symbolic. To me, it was proof that no matter how far I traveled, or how much stress I faced, she was the anchor I carried with me. I walked off that bus with a suitcase in one hand and that mug wrapped carefully in the other. I kept imagining her reaction, maybe even a laugh at how cheesy it was, followed by a hug that reminded me I had a place where I belonged. After months of grinding through classes and working part-time shifts just to survive, I thought coming home was my reward. The sanctuary I had been craving was supposed to be waiting for me at the end of the journey. But when I stepped onto that familiar street, something was different. The windows looked darker than I remembered. The air felt heavier. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just exhaustion from the long ride, that I was overthinking. My chest tightened with anticipation as I got closer. I thought I'd hear the sound of my dad working in the garage or my mom calling from the kitchen. Instead, there was nothing. Only silence, and the sight that turned my world upside down. Because when I finally reached my home, there was no warmth, no welcome, no sign that I was wanted. There was only the sound of cardboard shifting in the breeze. My entire life, my clothes, my books, even old trophies from childhood, stacked outside like trash waiting to be collected. And the mug I thought would make her smile felt like the cruelest joke of all, because there was no one there to give it to. No arms waiting. No laughter. Just boxes and a silence so loud it drowned out everything else. But the boxes weren't the only sign that everything had changed. As I stepped closer, I saw details that confirmed my worst fears. The garden was dead. The grass that my father once obsessed over every weekend was now brittle, brown, and snapping under my shoes. The rosebush my mother used to prune each spring was nothing more than thorny stems, long forgotten. Even the air felt abandoned, as though the house itself had been emptied of breath. I walked slower with each step, my stomach twisting tighter, trying to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe they had left for a trip, maybe they were just away for the weekend. But the truth was harder, waiting for me at the porch. The mailbox was stuffed to bursting, sagging with envelopes and grocery store ads, as if weeks had passed without anyone opening it. I pulled one out just to be sure, and the date confirmed it. This wasn't a single day's neglect. This was deliberate absence. That was when my eyes caught it, taped awkwardly to the side of the broken porch lamp, fluttering in the wind, a scrap of paper. My father's handwriting, unmistakable, carved across it with a pen that pressed too hard. Handle it yourself. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My hands shook as I peeled it off, reading the words again and again, as if I'd misunderstood. But there was no mistake. My parents had reduced 22 years of family, of promises, of memories to 4 words. It wasn't just a note, it was a declaration that I was no longer theirs to care for, that I had been cut loose. In disbelief, I dropped my bags right there on the porch and pulled out my phone. I dialed my father's number first. Straight to voicemail. Then my mother's. It rang 3 times before the call broke. Again. And again. I called until my thumb ached from hitting redial, until the silence felt louder than the dial tone. Finally, on what must have been the 10th attempt, my mother picked up. I opened my mouth, but before I could even ask why, she said 4 words I will never forget: we had no choice. And then the line went dead. No explanation, no comfort, no promise of fixing it. Just finality. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear long after the call had ended, listening to nothing but the sound of my own breath. I wanted to scream, to beg for answers, but there was no one to hear me. The windows were dark, the house was hollow, and the voices I had spent months aching to hear were gone, replaced by strangers who were already circling the property, eyeing what had once been mine. That was the moment my world cracked open. Not when I saw the boxes, not when I read the note, but when I realized that the people who were supposed to stand by me, the ones who were supposed to be my safety net, had chosen to disappear instead. They hadn't just sold a house, they had sold me out of their lives. And in that instant, I understood something I hadn't wanted to believe: the family I thought I had no longer existed. I stood there on the porch, staring at the lifeless house that had once been my anchor, clutching my phone like it was the last thread tying me to sanity. I thought maybe, just maybe, someone else in the family would care enough to help. So I started dialing. First, my cousins. They'd been the ones who always promised, family first, no matter what. But when I explained what happened, the silence on the other end told me more than words ever could. One said she didn't have the space. Another said things were complicated. Complicated was just another way of saying don't come here. I tried neighbors, people who had watched me grow up, people who used to wave when I rode my bike down the street. Their tone was polite, but distant. One pretended not to know what had happened, though I could hear the hesitation in his voice, like he knew more than he wanted to admit. Another offered a list of shelters in town, as if that was the same thing as opening a door. By the time I reached out to old friends from high school, desperation had settled in. I told myself it was just temporary, just a place to rest until I figured things out. But their responses cut deep. Most didn't answer at all. The few that did gave excuses that stung worse than rejection. I wish I could, man, but you know how it is. Some didn't even bother with explanations, only a quick sorry before hanging up. It felt like every call chipped away at the idea that I wasn't completely alone. Each voice I reached out for turned to mist the moment I thought I could lean on it. It wasn't just my parents who had abandoned me, it was everyone I thought might step up when the unthinkable happened. That realization was almost as heavy as the betrayal itself. Then, almost as a last resort, I scrolled through my contacts and stopped at a name that didn't carry the weight of broken promises: Marcellus, my college roommate. We'd pulled all-nighters together, laughed over cheap pizza, and shared the kind of camaraderie that comes from struggling side by side. I hesitated before calling. Why would he help when even blood relatives turned me away? But I pressed dial anyway, because I had nothing left to lose. He picked up on the second ring. His voice was groggy, but when I told him what happened, he didn't pause, didn't calculate, didn't make excuses. His response was immediate, simple, and filled with something I hadn't heard all day: sincerity. Crash on my couch, man. You're not alone in this. Those words hit me harder than any rejection. They weren't dressed up in pity or hollow promises, they were an anchor tossed into the storm. In that moment, it didn't matter that I'd lost my home, or that my family had chosen to erase me from their lives. I had one person willing to stand by me without hesitation. For the first time that day, I felt a spark of hope. Not the kind of hope that everything would magically go back to the way it was, but the fragile kind that whispers, "You're not finished yet." It was enough to keep me moving, enough to remind me that sometimes family isn't who you're born to, it's who shows up when the world turns its back. That night, I lay on Marcellus's couch, a stranger in what was now supposed to be my refuge. Around me were the same boxes that had been tossed outside my childhood home only hours before, stacked awkwardly in the corner of his living room. They weren't just boxes anymore, they felt like tombstones, reminders of a life buried without warning. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that note again: handle it yourself. My father's handwriting cut deeper than any knife. Sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of years pressing down. 22 years of believing in family loyalty. 22 years of thinking I could count on people who now proved otherwise. And with every passing second, the anger inside me began to shift into something harder, sharper. That was when the vow formed. I reached for my phone, scrolling to my parents' numbers. My thumb hovered for a moment, but only for a moment. Then I hit block. Their calls would never reach me again. Their names, which once meant safety, now meant betrayal. One by one, I deleted their contacts. A strange calm came over me as the screen emptied of their presence. It was like I was cutting away dead weight, carving out space for something new. But this wasn't just about erasing them from my phone, it was about erasing the hold they had on my spirit. For years, I had begged for approval, stretched myself thin trying to make them proud, waiting for a smile or a word of praise. That night, staring at those boxes, I swore I would never beg again. I would never ask them for shelter, love, or validation. They made their choice when they sold the roof over my head. Now, I was making mine. In that vow, I realized something that resonates with anyone who has ever been cut off, especially seniors who've lived long enough to know betrayal doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes, it's the people you shared a table with, the ones you trusted most, who will teach you the harshest lessons. And yet, even in that pain, there's a truth worth holding on to: rejection can be the seed of independence. I told myself that night, I will stand on my own, even if it breaks me at first. I didn't know how I'd pay for an apartment, or finish my degree while working, or rebuild what had been torn apart. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would not crawl back. That moment wasn't a dramatic declaration shouted into the night. It was quiet, almost whispered, but it carried the weight of a new identity. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to save me. I was deciding to save myself. And that vow, born out of betrayal and loneliness, became the line that divided the old me from the new. The old me still longed for home. The new me would build one with her own hands. Living with Marcellus was supposed to be temporary, just a couch to crash on until I figured out where to go next. At first, I told myself it would be a week, maybe 2. But that borrowed couch turned into something far greater, the foundation of my new life. It wasn't glamorous. His living room doubled as my bedroom, my office, and sometimes even my dining hall, but it was safe. And in the chaos of losing everything, safety was the first brick I needed to rebuild. I threw myself into work because it was the only thing I could control. I picked up late-night shifts in IT support, troubleshooting problems for people who would never know my story. The calls blurred together, resetting passwords, calming angry clients, solving errors at 2 in the morning. But every paycheck was a reminder that I was still moving forward. I tightened my budget until it squeaked, saving every dollar I could. Ramen noodles became my staple meal, second-hand clothes became my uniform, and every expense I cut felt like another brick laid on the path to freedom. But I didn't stop at just surviving. I pushed harder in my studies than I ever had before. Cybersecurity wasn't just my major anymore, it became my lifeline. I spent nights buried in textbooks, mornings poring over code, afternoons chasing certifications that most students wouldn't touch until years later. Each new skill I mastered gave me something my parents couldn't take away, proof of my own resilience. It was during this grind that I caught the attention of Professor Zariah Klein. She wasn't the type to hand out compliments, but she noticed the changes in me. After class one day, she pulled me aside. Her words were simple, but they cut through the fog I'd been living in. Family isn't the people who abandon you, Eldrick. Family is the ones who show up when it counts. Those words landed heavier than she probably realized. Until then, I had defined family as blood, as the people who shared my last name, the ones who had raised me. But when they walked away, it was Marcellus who gave me shelter. It was my professor who believed in me. It was the people who chose to stand by me, not the ones tied to me by obligation, who deserved the title of family. Slowly, I began to transform, not just in my career, but in who I was. I went from the abandoned son with boxes stacked on a porch to a young man with a plan, a purpose, and a growing sense of pride. Each saved paycheck was a reminder that I could survive without the people who betrayed me. Each new skill was proof that I could thrive beyond their shadow. For the first time, I began to picture a future that didn't include them. A future where my success wasn't dependent on their approval, where my identity wasn't tied to being someone's child, but to being someone who refused to break. Living with Marcellus was never the plan, but it became the soil where I was replanted. And from that soil, piece by piece, I built myself back up. Months later, when the sting of betrayal had dulled just enough for me to breathe without anger tightening my chest, the truth finally surfaced. Until then, I had convinced myself there had to be some justification, some reason that explained why parents would sell their own child's home and leave him with nothing but boxes on a porch. I told myself maybe they were drowning in debt, maybe the house payments had spiraled out of control, maybe they had been desperate. Desperation, at least, was human. It was forgivable. But then I ran into Mrs. Ellison, the neighbor who had lived 2 doors down my whole life. She had watched me grow up, given me cookies at Halloween, and sat beside my mother during Sunday yard sales. When she saw me, she hesitated, as though she wasn't sure if speaking would help me or hurt me. But the truth came anyway, spilling out in a whisper heavy with pity. Your parents weren't struggling, Eldrick. They weren't forced to sell. She glanced away before finishing. They sold the house to live it up. Cruises. Resorts. Parties you wouldn't believe. They were bragging about it, showing photos around like trophies. They cashed out while you were away, and they didn't look back. Her words hit me like a second betrayal, one even sharper than the first. Because up until then, I had comforted myself with the idea that maybe they were victims of circumstance. Maybe life had cornered them, and I was just collateral damage in a cruel situation. But the truth stripped that comfort away. They hadn't been victims. They had been architects of betrayal, choosing indulgence over responsibility, luxury over loyalty. While I was in the library pulling all-nighters, fueled by stale coffee and a vision of making them proud, they were sipping cocktails on white sand beaches, laughing as if the son they abandoned didn't exist. While I carried a small mug through airport security, eager to hand it to my mother with a smile, she was holding champagne flutes in ballrooms, surrounded by people who didn't know or care about the son she had discarded. It wasn't desperation that drove them. It was selfishness dressed up as freedom. It was betrayal, planned and polished. They had taken the one thing that had been stable in my life, cashed it out, and used it to fuel their escape. That revelation hardened something inside me. The faint trace of sympathy I had held on to evaporated. The version of the story where I could someday forgive them crumbled. What was left was clarity. They didn't stumble into this mistake, they orchestrated it. And in doing so, they made one thing clear: I owed them nothing. For seniors who hear this, the lesson is painful but necessary. Betrayal doesn't always come wrapped in poverty or crisis. Sometimes it comes dressed in glitter, hiding beneath the illusion of joy. It teaches you to look closer, to see the truth behind the performance. From that day on, I stopped telling myself comforting lies. My parents had chosen their luxury over my life. And once I accepted that, I stopped waiting for explanations that would never come. Then one day, months after I had started piecing my life together, I saw something I never expected, a Facebook message request. At first, I thought it was spam, the kind of random note you delete without reading. But when I clicked it open, my heart stopped. The names staring back at me were the very ones I had blocked out of my phone, my mind, and my life, my parents. The message was short, almost pitiful. "We need you. Please come back. We're losing everything." For a long moment, I just stared at the words, my pulse loud in my ears. These were the same people who had sold my home, discarded my belongings, and told me to handle it myself. The same voices that had gone silent when I begged for answers. Now, suddenly, they remembered me, not as their son, but as a lifeline. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I read the message again and again, trying to process the shift. They had gone from untouchable, living their life of luxury, to desperate, clawing for help. And for the first time since this all began, I realized something had changed. I wasn't the powerless kid left with boxes on a porch anymore. I wasn't the one begging for shelter or answers. I was the one holding the power. It didn't end with one message. Soon, there were more. Long paragraphs about how difficult things had become, how people had turned on them, how they just needed a second chance. They tried every angle, pleading, guilt-tripping, even pretending like nothing had ever happened. "You're still our son," one message read. Another said, "Family should stick together, no matter what." But their sudden declarations of love only exposed the truth. Where was that loyalty when they cashed out the house? Where was that unconditional bond when they left me standing on a driveway surrounded by boxes? It was clear now, they didn't want reconciliation. They wanted rescue. I scrolled through the photos they had once bragged about online, vacations, parties, designer clothes. All of it paid for with the sale of the home I had once belonged to. And now, as the money dried up, they turned back to the son they had abandoned, hoping he would save them from their own choices. It struck me then how karma works in ways you don't always expect. Sometimes it doesn't come as a thunderclap of justice, it comes as a quiet reversal. They went from laughing in luxury to pleading in scarcity. They went from erasing me to searching for me. And in that reversal, all the balance shifted. I didn't feel the urge to scream at them, or even to demand answers. I simply felt the weight of irony pressing down. They had written me out of their lives, and now, they were writing to me, asking to be let back in. For the first time, I wasn't the one chasing. I wasn't the one begging. They were. And that realization was its own kind of power. I sat there with the message open, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, the silence of the room pressing in on me. For years, I had carried their words like chains, "Handle it yourself." Those 4 words had followed me into every sleepless night, every hour spent rebuilding from nothing. And now here they were, begging me to undo the very independence they had forced upon me. For a brief moment, the old version of me stirred. The son who had once longed for their approval, who would have done anything for a kind word, almost reached out. Almost. But then I remembered the driveway, the boxes, the note taped to the lamp. I remembered the silence on the phone when I called for help. I remembered every closed door, every excuse, every betrayal. That memory hardened me like steel. So I typed one sentence. Just one. "You told me to handle it myself. Now it's your turn." I read it twice, not because I doubted it, but because it was the most honest response I could give. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't embellished, it was a mirror. A reflection of the very words they had carved into me. And then, with a steadiness I hadn't felt before, I hit send. Immediately after, I did what I should have done long ago, I blocked them. Again. Their desperate pleas had found their way through Facebook this time, but I knew how this game worked. They would try other ways. And I was right. The email started first. Long paragraphs filled with apologies that sounded more like rehearsed lines than real regret. Then came the letters, stuffed into envelopes with shaky handwriting, mailed to Marcellus's apartment. Some begged. Others accused me of being heartless, of forgetting my duty as a son. And when those failed, they resorted to fake accounts online, sending messages that pretended to be from strangers, all with the same purpose, getting me to open the door they had slammed shut years ago. But I didn't answer. Not once. Not a call, not a text, not a letter returned. I stayed silent. And that silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. Because silence told them the truth, they no longer had control over me. For the first time, I understood that revenge doesn't always come with shouting or dramatic gestures. Sometimes the coldest revenge is refusal. The refusal to give in. The refusal to play the role they expect. The refusal to let them use me as their safety net after tearing mine apart. My silence became my statement. My refusal became my power. And as the weeks passed, I watched their attempts grow more frantic, more desperate. But every time I ignored them, every time I chose myself over their chaos, I felt a piece of my old pain fade away. That was my revenge, not revenge built on destroying them, but on refusing to let them destroy me again. They had left me to handle it myself. And now, it was finally their turn. Months later, just when life had started to feel stable again, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't a friend, or a delivery, or a neighbor. It was an IRS investigator, a badge clipped to his jacket, a folder of documents in his hand. For a split second, fear gripped me. I had spent months keeping my head down, working, studying, surviving. What could they possibly want with me? The investigator's words hit like thunder. My parents were under investigation. They weren't just careless with money, they had been tied to shady property deals, funneling profits, hiding assets, and cutting corners in ways that finally caught up to them. Suddenly, their desperation, their frantic messages, all made sense. They hadn't reached out because of love or remorse. They reached out because their empire of lies was collapsing, and they thought I might hold a rope they could climb. But this time, the rope wasn't theirs to grab. The investigator asked if I had anything that might help, any documents or proof of what they had been doing. For a moment, I froze. These were still my parents, people who had once tucked me into bed, who had taught me to ride a bike. But then I remembered the night I stood on that driveway, the sound of strangers' voices as they bargained over my childhood curtains, the note taped to a broken lamp, "Handle it yourself." So I opened my box of saved files, the fragments I had carried with me when I left. Old bank transfers, receipts, emails I had been copied on, and of course, the note they left me. Pieces of a puzzle that, alone, felt meaningless, but in the hands of the investigator, became evidence strong enough to seal their downfall. The process wasn't fast, but it was relentless. One hearing led to another. Their names began appearing in local news headlines, first as whispers, then as bold accusations. Friends who once toasted them at parties now avoided their calls. The people they had flaunted their wealth in front of became the same ones who gossiped about their disgrace. By the time it was over, my parents were stripped of the life they had traded me for. They faced lawsuits, public shame, and bankruptcy that left them with nothing. The cruises, the luxury homes, the designer clothes, gone, auctioned, or repossessed. They had built their comfort on betrayal, and karma had finally collected the debt. Meanwhile, my story moved in the opposite direction. While they sat in courtrooms, I walked into lecture halls with a new determination. While they watched their names drag through the mud, I walked across the graduation stage, diploma in hand, proof of every sacrifice I had made. And when my name was called, I felt the weight of the past lift. Because I hadn't just earned a degree, I had earned freedom. They had bet against me, believing I would crumble without them. Instead, I stood taller than ever, ready for a future they never believed I could reach. That was the final twist. They lost everything chasing greed, while I found everything they couldn't give me, strength, independence, and the kind of pride no betrayal could erase. In the end, their betrayal became the best thing that ever happened to me. At the time, it felt like my world was collapsing, like I had been cut loose with nothing but boxes and broken promises. But as the months unfolded, I began to see the truth. What they did wasn't just cruelty, it was a catalyst. It forced me to rebuild from nothing, to stand on my own, and to discover a strength I might never have found if they hadn't walked away. It's strange to say that being abandoned saved me, but it did. Without their decision to shut me out, I might have spent my life chasing their approval, waiting for validation that was never going to come. Instead, I learned how to validate myself. I learned how to survive long nights on my own, how to turn rejection into motivation, how to create a future with my own two hands. I became someone who could never be abandoned again, because once you've proven you can live without the people who betrayed you, no one else can ever hold that kind of power over you. And that's the lesson I want anyone listening, especially those who've lived long enough to know that betrayal isn't limited to the young, to take away. Whether you're 22 or 62, rejection hurts. It carves deep. But sometimes the wound becomes the doorway to a stronger version of yourself. Sometimes, the people who shut you out are the very ones who free you to walk into a better life. Karma doesn't always strike fast. It doesn't always happen in the moment when you're standing there in pain, wondering why justice seems silent. But when it comes with force. It's unstoppable. My parents traded love for luxury, and they lost everything. I lost them, but I gained myself. And in the end, that was the better trade. If this story spoke to you, don't just walk away. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Epic Karma Tales. Turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next, because the next tale will leave you speechless.